next few minutes, but we, as you probably just heard, we're recording this meeting, and we will publish it on the website after. But morning to everyone, and welcome to this morning's presentation. Thank you for giving up your time to come along today. My name's Kevin Singleton. I'm the Strategic Planning Manager, Herefordshire Council. And the session today really is to introduce what we're doing as part of the second consultation for the preparation of the local plan. This is still the Regulation 18 stage, which is still the option stage. So there's no proposals as such put forward as yet. But this particular stage is looking at what could be alternative approaches to the county-wide general planning policies. We need to do this really to check whether the existing policies are up to date. The core strategy was adopted now 7 years ago. And that is in terms of both national policy position, but also in terms of local aspirations. We're also going to be considering whether the policies could be more effective if they were redrafted, and also whether there are any key policy gaps which would require any new policies to be developed or additional criteria added to existing policies. And that's bearing in mind really that the government's ambition is for shorter and quicker to prepare plans. We're also going to hopefully consider which level of plan making some of these policies should sit. Should they be in neighbourhood plans, or should they be within local plans? So what we're going to do this morning is we'll start with a brief and fairly high level summary of the results of the first consultation that we held a couple of months ago, and Sam Banks will introduce that, and that will be followed by 3 short presentations looking at various topic areas of the plan, and they'll be split up with sort of a Q&A session between each, so that we don't have to remember sort of 12 or 13 policy areas in one go. So we're not necessarily covering everything in the policy options paper, but we're covering a significant ground, and hopefully we'll do it within a 2-hour period. And then at the end, I'll just sum up and go through some of the next steps. As I say, that the presentation will be published on the website so others can see it. This is the second session. We had another Parish Council one evening last week as well, and that was very useful. So again, thank you for all attending, and I'll pass over to Sam for the first part of the presentation.
Thank you, Kev. Just share the PowerPoint. So hopefully you can all see that now. So as Kevin says, I'll just go through a very high level results for the spatial options that you were consulted on during January and February this year. So just a few engagement statistics for you. So the spatial options consultation was held both on our Herefordshire Council website and on our Commonplace consultation platform. And we had 814 hits on the website. And as you can see, 3,624 on Commonplace. Out of those hits, that resulted in 550 respondents who made comments, and that included members of the public, parish councils and neighbouring authorities, and a wide range of statutory consultees you can see there, as well as businesses, developers and planning consultants. They generated a total of 954 comments and submitted around 25 either new settlements or site land submissions. So the strategic option results, if you remember, we asked you how the housing growth should be distributed across the county. So option 3, which was a focus for growth on Hereford and the market towns, came out as the most popular option. The distribution to market towns, as you can see there as being the growth town, collectively got 12%, and the new settlement obviously was ranked 5th in that order. The results for the rural areas, as you can see, that's far more finely balanced. The most preferred option was to focus settlements outside of the AONBs and conservation areas, but the distribution around the rural areas, as you can see, is balanced there. However, if you add together the focus on larger settlements and rural hubs, it comes to 47%. You can see that there is a more popular desire for development to be more focused within larger settlements than widely dispersed to a collection of smaller settlements around the county. So we asked questions about our vision and objective as drafted, and as you can see, 64% of people agreed with the vision and 63% agreed with the objectives. There were some comments about some fine tuning to some of the wording, but overall, people are relatively happy with the vision and direction of the plan so far. So we've looked at some of the recurring themes that have come forward, and there's 3 of those. The first one is transport, travel and movement. Lots of people are saying that we should invest in infrastructure and transport links when we're looking at where development should go. There should be an increased support for the move to electric vehicles. And consideration should be given to all sectors of the community when we're looking at distributing houses and transport networks, particularly for elderly and disabled members of the community and how they can get around. The differences between an urban and rural setting as far as active travel was highlighted. So, you know, it's fairly easy to make the switch potentially to buses and to bicycles in urban areas. It may not be so easy in rural settings. And the need to look for new developments linked to railways and transportation lines. So the next recurring theme was about climate change and sustainability. Lots of people are looking at the relationship between the natural world, so our habitats, our wildlife, natural infrastructure and climate change. There was obviously a concern about improving drainage and flood defences around the county. A push for more renewable energy and sustainable heating methods for any new development. And enabling, having policies which enable communities themselves to cope with those issues of climate change. And an importance on looking at more sustainable farming practices and protecting soils and the knock-on effect that that can have to the natural environment. And the final theme was around housing and design. There was lots of emphasis on making sure that any development that we proposed was of a good quality design and that had the ability for sustainable, affordable housing. That all environmental issues were taken into account in any future settlement hierarchy. That we looked at new technologies, the way that life has changed and our working practices have changed post-COVID. Lots of people made the comment of make sure we have the right house in the right place. And the issue of second homes and Airbnbs and the issue that that's making to affordability in the rural areas. And of course, the importance of key services whenever you propose development within a settlement. So those are some of the key themes and high-level themes that are coming out of the initial consultation. I'll now hand over to Dan, who will go through the first part of the policy option consultation for you. Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Sam, and good morning, everybody. So, as Sam said, the presentation we're going to do today is to outline the next stages of the local plan update, the policy options public consultation, which commenced on the 4th of April and closed on the 16th of May. And we're going to be asking for your views on policies covering a number of themes. A further public consultation will then take place later in the summer, which will gather views on the place-based options for Hereford, the market towns and the rural areas. So for this morning, for this presentation, we're going to cover 11 main policy themes in which we'll outline the main context and issues and raise some points for discussion. We'll go through these in 3 sections with breaks between them to give some time for question and answers. And although we'll be covering these as separate themes, we also recognise there are many interlinks between them. So, for example, a climate change policy may also focus on active travel which also has benefits for healthy lifestyles and so on. So the first theme we'll be covering today is in regards to climate change. So dealing with the worldwide effects of climate change were the biggest challenge our generation will ever face. The Climate Change Act sets out a legally binding target for the UK to achieve a net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. In 2019, Herefordshire Council unanimously declared a climate and ecological emergency, setting a target of carbon neutral by 2030. Policy and guidance suggest that plans should take a proactive approach to mitigating and adapting to climate change, and this should be the top priority for planning. Significant areas of Herefordshire are low-lying and liable to flooding. Climate change will further increase the risk and events of flooding across the county. Also, Herefordshire's rich biological and geological diversity is becoming increasingly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And on this slide, you'll see that shows that the average household consumption emissions of CO2 within Herefordshire are higher than the national average. And this can be attributed to the rural nature of the county, with more oil-fired heating systems and also generally poorer access to public transport. So some issues to consider in regards to climate change policy could be how can we ensure the principles of mitigation and adaptation are fully addressed? And should we include a detailed policy on climate change or embed it throughout all the local plan policies, or to have a combination of both? And you will see, as we discuss the other issues later on, that climate change is a recurring theme as it interlinked with many other themes. So the next section is in regards to natural and historic environment. The degradation of habitats and species is a national and local cause for concern. The Environment Act of 2021 seeks biodiversity net gain and local nature recovery strategies to help address the problem. Our current green and blue infrastructure evidence is now out of date and requires updating to address issues it can help with, such as climate change and flooding, the protection of water quality and the provision of sustainable drainage systems, SUDS, biodiversity, and the enhancement of local landscape character. Local plans should recognise the intrinsic character and beauty of the countryside, and that strategic policies should provide for the conservation and enhancement of landscapes. National guidance also states that local plans should set out a positive strategy for the conservation and enjoyment of the historic environment, including heritage assets most at risk through neglect, decay, or other threats. So from this, issues to consider within natural and historic environment policy could be, is there an option for a separate townscape policy as well as a dark sky policy? Should we be looking to maximise biodiversity net gain from 10%? Should we be looking to close the gap between the strategic and local biodiversity policies, rather than leaving it to the neighbourhood development plans at the local level? Should we consider a separate policy for biodiversity net gain that addresses many aspects of the plan? This can include areas such as transport proposals, housing, and community infrastructure. Current green infrastructure policy is not well used, but needs updating in line with current guidance. Should the policy be strengthened to address all types and scales of developments? And also, in the current policy framework for the historic environment, is this broadly effective? Minor updates could be made to reflect the latest guidance, and we could strengthen the requirement for heritage impact assessments to support certain planning applications. So on to the next theme, and this covers design. Design of buildings and places not only have a key role to play in aesthetics and sense of place, but also to respond to the climate emergency and help to mitigate efficient housing and inclusive infrastructure is key to enable communities to live healthy and active lives. Changes in the National Planning Guidance and in the introduction of the National Model Design Code and Guide place focus on building better quality, well-designed places and buildings that are sustainable. So the image on the slide here shows the 10 characteristics of well-designed places within recent national government policy. Herefordshire was selected to participate in the government's Design Code pilot, where design codes were tested on a local level with the participation of parish councils. Lessons learned from this valuable pilot study will be reflected in the new plan. So some issues to consider in regards to design policy could be how to create better and well-designed places in Herefordshire. Would this be by having a more detailed policies in the local plan, or place-based policies at a county level or local design guidance? Also, how should we include local communities in design policy? Should parish councils continue to develop local policy through the neighbourhood development plans and develop design codes? And how should design policies proactively deal with the climate emergency? Should policy promote low carbon and zero carbon developments in additional policy? So moving on to the next theme, which is in regards to transport. There's been significant changes in national transport policy in the last 12 to 18 months. The Department of Transport recently published its decarbonising transport strategy for Britain. The government is to fully decarbonise transport by 2050 and to end sales of all combustion vehicles to cut CO2 emissions to zero. In the recent Levelling Up White Paper, one of the missions is by 2030, local public transport connectivity across the country will be significantly closer to the standards of London for improved services, simpler fares, and also integrated ticketing. A new executive agency, Active Travel England, or ATE, has been launched this year. ATE will manage the National Active Transport Budget, awarding funding for projects that meet the new national standards. ATE will help local authorities in spreading good practice and also become a statutory consultee on major planning applications. Transport policies need to be consistent with the Council's climate emergency to minimise our impact on the environment. The Hereford Master Plan was commissioned in February 2020 to assess the best options to provide a modern transport system for the city, which will address the declared climate emergency, support the local economy, protect the environment, and generate wider society benefits. The local transport plan to cover all of Herefordshire will be updated in the next 18 months. And additionally, a transport scoping board is being commissioned. This is going to comprise of 2 stages. Stage 1 will consist of a high-level scoping assessment of the likely transport scenarios outlined within the Spatial Options Consultation. Stage 2 will consist of a more detailed transport assessment once site capacities are known. The scoping report is expected to be completed by the end of this summer. So points for discussions in regards to transport policy could be the requirement of electric car charging points for new developments could be added to the transport policy, which will reflect the recent national and local policy changes since the core strategy was published. Reducing carbon emissions could also be added to the text to give greater emphasis to the climate change emergency. New developments will need to be designed to reduce the need to travel, to support travel modes and access to public transport. Herefordshire is a rural county, and transport policy could perhaps more emphasis on sustainable travel in the rural areas, such as introducing rural cycle highways. This could encourage more cycle use on the main A roads in the county. An additional policy could be drafted to reflect the National Design Code in relation to transport. This could create a greater integration to the local plan policies on design, and also to emphasise the importance of active travel and accessibility. A hierarchy of transport could be referenced within this policy for development proposals. This would have an aspiration to prioritise walking, cycling, and public transportation over the use of private cars. And this would also be consistent to the Council's climate emergency declaration. So we'll be now taking a pause on the policy options to consider the last four themes. And those 4 themes, just to summarise, have been climate change, historic and natural environment, design, and transport. Thank you.
I don't know if anyone's got any questions or comments on that. If anyone could raise their hand, that would be useful, and we can call them forward. Sorry, Scott Crowley got a hand up.
Hello, hi, yes, so I represent Callow and Haywood Group Parish Council, just south of the city. One of the points, I think, in the climate thing, you mentioned the dark sky element. I think that's certainly for our community, that's something that's quite important, and a number of local residents have expressed concern about some planning decisions in the past where there isn't necessarily anything particularly explicit, I think, in either the core strategy or even our own neighbourhood plan, to ask people to sort of minimise excess light at night and so on. So that's certainly something that I suspect would be a benefit in parishes like ours and perhaps other ones. I suppose my other point was about the question about how to involve communities in design, and the question of should parish councils still lead on the neighbourhood plans. I suppose my question would be, if parish councils weren't to do it, who would do it? Unless there were communities that had a separate group of people who were able to kind of form together and do that. So it seems to me to make sense that parish councils should lead on that, unless another group feels better placed to do it. But there is obviously the challenge of getting proper support from people who have planning knowledge in that process.
Thank you for that. Helen Hamilton.
Yes, good morning. My question really is, well, it's a concern really. It's about actually the implementation of policies once you've drafted this plan, because there are already pretty good policies in the core strategy that we've got. For example, SD1, which should require quite serious consideration about renewable energy and orientation of buildings and renewable building materials and so on, which we never actually see applied in, or very, very rarely see applied to any planning decisions. And we've got, and talking about biodiversity, I don't know whether anybody saw the Environment Agency's report published last week into the condition of the River Wye, which contains some absolutely terrifying statistics. So in the English side of the Wye catchment, between 2016 and 2020, nearly 4,000 hectares of hedgerow was lost. And in that same period, the land use changed from 50% permanent pasture to 70% arable. Now, those are the issues that need to be addressed when looking at biodiversity loss and climate change and flood risk. And these can and should have been addressed through planning long ago. A lot of this change is related to the increase in intensive livestock production and anaerobic digesters. And if the council and the core strategy is going to address these matters seriously, they need to be able to look at land use across the county as a whole, not just a question of whether people are using electric cars or where houses are located.
Okay, thank you. I mean, there's aspects of that which are beyond, outside of the scope of planning necessarily to control as well, in terms of the actual, whether it's arable or pasture.
No, because the switch to arable has arisen from the permissions that have been granted for anaerobic digesters, because the big increase has been in the production of maize. These matters were raised when permissions for anaerobic digesters were granted, but they were not considered during the planning process. So these are the consequence of planning decisions, as indeed are the losses of hedgerow, where I do understand the problems of lack of resource within the council, but and that is a serious consideration when you get hedgerow removal notices. But also there's a lack of enforcement where hedgerows are removed. I mean, that's an extraordinary figure. 4,000. It's something like 3,900 hectares of hedgerow lost in just 4 years, and who knows what's happened since 2020. So these are planning decisions. You know, again, the granting of permissions and the lack of enforcement when buildings are changed to use for intensive pig units, for example, and these new agricultural buildings which are applied for as general purpose buildings and then used as livestock buildings, taking the livestock off the land and putting it into buildings. All of these are planning matters and planning decisions that need to be much more tightly controlled. Okay,
well thanks for that. So, some of that is beyond, I suppose, what we can necessarily talk to you about today in terms of the development of new policy. But yeah, I understand that. Resources is an issue, and it's likely to be. But my guess is ongoing into the future. We need to, but equally, we need to get the policy position right, so that enforcement action can be taken as we go forward. I mean, clearly the issues around the River Wye are serious. They'll be challenging to the plan as it advances, and they will need to be addressed. And the plan ultimately will need to be compliant with the habitat regulations before it's adopted. So we recognise there's huge challenges going forward. But it's about today, I suppose, it's about ensuring that the policies are at least the best they can be and as enforceable as they can be. We'll touch on agricultural or the rural areas and whether there's need for additional agricultural type policies later. Equally, there's another local plan looking at things like agricultural waste, the minerals and waste local plan, which will be subject to examination in public later this year as well. So there's a number of fronts that we're examining these issues on, which are not necessarily all around the development of the new plan, but I understand the points you're making about the need to address environmental matters across the county. Rose Yarpole, hand up.
Yeah. Hi, Rose Jenkins here from Yarpole. I understand planning focuses mainly on new developments, new build houses, but in this county we will continue to have much old housing with problems of the oil-fired heating and the insulation that were also mentioned. And I just wonder if there's any way of linking in the concerns on the two accommodation types, new build, but also concern for the problems being faced by the significant number of older buildings towards the climate change challenges.
You're right that primarily we're dealing with new development, but whether there's a role for planning so 106 agreements or whatever replaces what Section 106 agreements in terms of retrofitting and so on, it's something that we can explore. But primarily we're talking about new development, I suppose, and ensuring that new development is as good as it can be in terms of its sustainability credentials, which is something we'll probably touch on later in the presentations as well. Anna Coda.
Hello. The first point I wanted to make was about the consultation. I mean, you went through the consultation, the numbers of people involved. That's a really tiny number of people compared to the population of Herefordshire. So I think we should be careful about how much weighting we put on that. And I suspect it's highly weighted towards people who've got a really big interest in it rather than individuals. And I speak as somebody whose daughter did make a submission on behalf of our parish council. The second point I was going to make was actually as a response to Rose, is that I'm not, as somebody who has a role in a small farm, I'm not sure how much effect the council can have directly on farming practices, but anaerobic digesters are a real problem. Obviously they have planning permission, and anaerobic digesters have very little to do with farming, but everything to do with, certainly in the past, about making money from the fuel, or potentially in the past, for the fuel burning and electrical generation. but she's right about the effect they have on farming. I'm not sure what the council could do about hedgerows. The other point I wanted to make was about planning. I mean, yes, the last speaker was quite correct about the old housing stock we have and the problems in rural areas of fossil fuel usage. And I live in a drafty old house myself, but there has been an awful lot of new building going on in Herefordshire. And I'm really, and that's not laying all this blame at the foot of the current council, because I suspect the planning permissions for stuff that's being built at the moment predates the change in control, or some of it will. But we haven't used the planning enough to have properly insulated houses, even things like the orientation. Solar cells on the roof, charging points already mentioned. There's just loads we can do about conditions we put on new build planning, and then of course it needs to be enforced.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and I suppose this is the opportunity to look at those policies again and try and ensure that they're better than they were last time. They meet the requirements as we go forward. We're obviously consulting on an SPD at the moment on environmental building standards as well, which potentially will enable us to develop stronger policies as we go forward for that. Jeff Hughes has got his hand up.
Yeah. Hi. I suppose I'm picking up on the last point, really, that I continue to be absolutely amazed at how much developers can get away with in terms of proposing minimal details on design and energy efficiency. So, for instance, you can propose to build a house, and it can go all through the planning process, but there's no mention of the type of heating that it uses. And to me, there should be, the local plan should be very specific on what is required when new developments are designed and put through the planning process. And that should be both local plan and also then come down to neighbourhood development plans to make sure that happens locally. I also wanted to comment on the previous lady's comment. One of my concerns always with planning, and this might continue to be the case, is our reliance on enforcement. So if a developer doesn't do what they're supposed to do, what happens? And far too much relies on a case then having to be picked up by the enforcement officer, some of which are seen as priorities, some of which are not, and just once again allow a developer to get away with quite a significant amount of leeway.
Thank you for that. One thing I would say is that there is an enforcement plan which is in preparation as well, which I'm assuming so it's not something that my team is preparing at the moment, but I would expect that to be subject to consultation as that is developed as well. I think Mr. Crippins wanted to say something. Is that correct?
Yes. Good morning, everybody. We've heard some good stuff just now. This is quite a complicated topic, and it takes a lot of digesting. There have been some very relevant comments. I particularly want to support what Helen said, because we are faced in the short to medium term with a very serious environmental problem with the pollution of the River Wye. The previous UDP contained policies to control the environmental impacts of intensive animal and poultry production. These were lost when the UDP ceased to have effect. In view of the widespread public concern over the pollution of agricultural land and waters by the disposal of the waste generated by IPUs and intensive farming practices, the revised core strategy needs to address this matter. And that presumably the writing out of those policies by a previous administration with a political decision. The politics of the authority has changed. And I very much hope that the authority will now, in this process of revising this document, take on board the very real concerns, both locally and nationally and even internationally, over the effects of agricultural pollution on the surface waters and subsurface waters of the county. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And as I say, this is the opportunity to look at gaps in policies and so on as we move forward, and look at the effectiveness of existing policies and so on. So thank you for that, and hopefully we'll have representations from parishes and other organisations making that point. I see Siobhan, one of our planners, has got her hand up.
Oh, thank you. Yes, Kev, I just wanted to highlight, because there's been a mention of hedgerow and the loss of it. In the green infrastructure and blue infrastructure section of the policy options document, there is an option in there whether we consider the need for a policy on trees and hedgerows. So it's set out in that section there for those who have mentioned that, and I think it might be helpful to comment on that when you are feeding back to us.
Thank you, Siobhan. Scott Crowley.
Thanks. Yes. One thing that just occurred to me, which may be a relatively minor thing, but it was around the sort of green alternatives in terms of transport. Obviously, there's a great focus on shifting from fossil fuel to electric, which is part of the solution. But electric is not a particularly good solution for sort of large scale machinery, and so there is a sort of need for exploring things like hydrogen power for things like sort of trucks and machinery. And I appreciate we don't have a lot of heavy industry, but in terms of places like sort of the Rotherwas industrial estate and so on, there's probably a need to consider the other green alternatives as well as just electric. And I appreciate it's early days.
I don't think you should see you at the moment. He's gone anyway. Where's he going?
Yeah, thank you for that, Scott. And yeah, again, we'll cover potentially sort of green industry slightly later in the presentation as well. Sylvia, and then
hi.
Yes, hi.
Yeah, hi everyone. Sylvia Matthews, Chairman, Llangowren Parish Council. Just on the hedgerows issue, it would be really good if the policy actually got rid of the approach which happens at the moment, where mature, sometimes hundreds of year old hedgerow is removed, and then the developer says a new more hedgerow will be planted instead. And of course, the hedgerow that is being planted is no substitute for the mature hedgerow with multiple species in it, which has been removed. Often it's of poor quality, and certainly in our area, the hedgerow which is put up for new developments is frequently, when it's actually planted, it turns out to be single species, and sometimes not even native species, and there's no enforcement of it. So we're seeing a huge degradation, I beg your pardon, in the quality of the natural environment, really by stealth, and it's developers just implying that by putting up a few little tiny whips of native species, which is usually beech, that will compensate. So I really hope that there'll be some action on that in the policies. Thank you.
Thank you. Heloise, and then I think after Heloise, I think we'll move to the second part of the presentation, but continue, please, Heloise.
Okay, I'd like to support most of the points that have gone ahead. I think particularly Helen's point about policy and planning permissions for aerobic digesters. Given current energy situation, there's likely to be even more pressure on that. and the points made on enforcement. Apologies, I should have said I'm Wellington Heath Parish Council. I think it brings the whole planning process into disrepute, what we have seen going on in Wellington Heath, with total disregard for planning conditions in some of the recent developments, which hopefully is getting a bit better. However, I was just going to ask about the rural highways for bicycles, which is something I'm interested in, and what ideas you have on those. And to make the point, at the moment, cycling is gaining in popularity, and electric bikes are quite a good innovation for people who can afford them or be helped to afford them, because it means you can travel further. But in terms of using those, for instance, for work, getting to Hereford from Ledbury, for instance, or to places in between, I think the lack of safe cycle lanes on the major roads is an issue. So cycling then becomes really a leisure pursuit, because it's only on the smaller roads you'd really want to cycle for any distance.
Thank you. What I'd say in terms of there's some initial work being done on things like former railway lines and such like across the county to see whether they can be used for things like cycle and cycleways. So it's a fairly initial stage, but that's the sort of thing we're looking, or potentially looking at, in terms of the sort of rural highway network for cycles and so on. There's also potential for the canal, the Hereford Gloucester Canal, possibly to be used in a similar sort of way. So that's the sort of areas the council is looking at the moment in terms of that.
Okay, so that's more leisure cycling, really.
Oh, well, potentially, although some of them do link up. They link up the towns and the villages in between, obviously. So
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Thank you. I think if we could move on to the second part of the presentation, we'll cover a few more topic areas, and then have a similar Q&A session at the end. This is Siobhan, I think, is going to take us through these areas.
Yep, that's right. Thank you, Kev. Good morning, everybody. My name is Siobhan Riddle, so I'm just going to take you through a few topics here relating to housing and mainly rural areas and the type of policies that come up there. So the first issue, housing. Housing affordability is a significant issue in the county. The lack of affordable housing greatly limits opportunities for younger and lower income households to be able to afford to buy their own home, which presents a significant obstacle to achieving social mobility. Housing affordability and mix still remains a particular issue in the more rural areas. A recent survey of parish councils in February of this year frequently highlighted a lack of affordable units being delivered in their areas. This is in part due to the size of developments that come forward, typically having small-scale sites under 10 dwellings, and these developments are insufficient in scale to be able to trigger national policy requirements to contribute to a range and mix of housing types and tenures. The other area is there has been a travelling community in Herefordshire for the last 500 years. Travellers live in different ways, including permanently on the road in caravans or mobile homes, or in settled accommodation for part or all of the year. It is recognised that there is a lack of availability of sites in comparison to finding sites for settled housing, and this can create issues in terms of location of new sites in the county. A gypsy and traveller accommodation assessment is underway, and we are expecting the findings soon. This will tell us how many traveller pitches and show person plots will be required. In addition to this, the government is keen to promote alternative means of delivering housing to boost the supply and widen choice. And one example of this is providing more plots for self-build projects. So suggestions for your comments then would be, what types of specialist housing are required to respond to the needs of the local population? Has national policy on affordable housing in rural areas prevented some housing in the rural areas? In what ways can we address the lack of affordable housing in the rural areas? How can we identify good sites for the travelling community? How can housing policies proactively promote alternative means of affordable housing delivery, such as self-build and community-led housing projects? So moving on to the next theme, which covers community, open space and health. Numerous studies have concluded a direct link between happiness and the quality of living environments, especially links to green spaces and nature. The impact sport and physical activity can have on mental well-being is every bit as important as the physical benefits. Open spaces can also have other invaluable uses relating to the preservation of species and a tool in tackling climate change, especially playing a part in flood mitigation strategies and carbon reduction. Some statistics in regards to community engagement, physical activity and open space are shown here. The main issues the local plan will need to address is it must ensure that all Herefordshire's population have good access to community and health services. New developments should be designed in a way to enable healthy and active lifestyles for all across Herefordshire. Maintaining good quality open space for a range of sport and recreational purposes, as well as extending green and blue infrastructure networks, will be a key requirement. So some things for you to comment on would be, how can we ensure that land use planning promotes good health and well-being in the county? How can we ensure that existing social and community facilities in the county are retained? Do we need a different approach for this to the different areas of the county, such as the rural and urban areas? How can open space incorporate opportunities to allow biodiversity to thrive and for rewilding? How do we ensure that health issues are embedded throughout the plan? How can open space accommodate more community growth and other local sustainable food production practice to support community cohesion? Now we'll move on to the theme of housing in rural areas. Herefordshire is a truly rural county with 53% of its population in the rural areas. National policy and guidance indicates that planning policy should be responsive to local circumstances and support housing that reflects local needs. Housing needs should be identified for villages to grow, thrive, and support local services. Policies should also seek to resist the unsustainable development of isolated homes in the countryside. Feedback from the questionnaire suggests to us that a set of criteria for what constitutes exceptional design quality with regard to allowing dwellings in the open countryside should be defined in policy. There is an opportunity for policy to make reference to potential self-build dwellings in these locations. We could also explore the potential to impose limits on the size of isolated countryside dwellings and examine opportunities for carbon reduction where possible. In regards to the conversion of rural buildings, feedback recommended that the policy should be strong and robust enough to ensure that the conversion of buildings is in sustainable and suitable locations. We can look at the issue of redundancy to determine whether a policy should include criteria requiring applicants to demonstrate the redundancy of buildings to prevent the conversion of recently constructed buildings for alternative uses. However, national guidance, which is the class Q in permitted development rights, this means it is difficult to control the development of agricultural buildings in many instances. Policies relating to the economy in the rural areas could include policies relating to agricultural and food production developments within the countryside. So some suggestions for your comments. Should policies for the rural areas only be updated to reflect current national guidance? Should any policies relating to the developments in open countryside take more of a local place-based approach? Should additional policies regarding size standards be added to rural area policies? should policies be added regarding adaptable living opportunities within open countryside? And should there be additional policy specifically for seasonal workers' accommodation? So now we consider the role of neighbourhood planning in the county going forward. Excuse me. Herefordshire has taken a positive approach to neighbourhood planning since its introduction in the Localism Act. With an enthusiastic take-up rate by a large proportion of parishes across the county, the uptake is 89% of parishes in Herefordshire. It is important that as the new local plan is produced, that new and updated NDPs generally conform to those new county-wide policies. After 10 years in practice, it is now appropriate that we can review the role that they play going forward and how they may align with the next local plan. So some suggestions for your comments here. The current level of local distinctive policy making at parish and community level has been relatively successful. There are a significant number of neighbourhood development plans in Herefordshire, and these can form the basis for a review of the emerging local plan strategic policies. Should we continue with this approach, or may they play a different role going forward? It has been raised by town and parishes that the one area which has proved to be locally contentious and requires the most technical support has been identifying and allocating housing development sites. This raises the question of, do we revert to the site allocations and settlement boundary delineation back to the local planning authority? However, this would erode the underlying principle of neighbourhood planning in that communities are able to shape the places in which they live. Town and parish councils could prepare design codes for their local areas rather than a neighbourhood plan. This would follow the government guidance within recent National Model Design Code and the National Model Design Guide. With this approach, all other aspects of local policies could be covered within the new local plan. However, this may be seen as a backward step after the success of so many locally produced neighbourhood plans and policies in the last decade. So that's just a summary there of the topics I've just spoken about. So it's good now if we can focus on those particular areas for the discussion part of this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you again. Has anyone got any initial points to make, comments to make, or questions? I understand that I might have missed Susan earlier wanted to comment. Is that correct, Susan? Did you want to comment or ask a question from?
Well, my main point actually was covered by the last speaker from Wellington Heath, which is about cycle routes within the county.
Okay.
Because I think just having a narrow lane for cyclists along an A route is not going to really do the business. And as someone who lives on the A4103, where there's a lot of lorries, I think there need to be separate cycle routes identified, possibly using B roads, or I like the suggestion about the canal route because it was a contour-based gradient, so it'd be easier for bikes if we had a cycle route combined with the old Hereford Canal. But I don't know how you would achieve that given the cost and all that kind of thing. But actually on the current topic, I think if you take away settlement boundaries from the local neighbourhood plans, I just don't see the point of them. I mean, they feel a bit like a fig leaf at the best of times, you know, so you've got to give them some teeth if anyone's going to bother going through the long convoluted process required. Thank you.
Thank you. any other comments on the topic?
Helen's got her hand up, Kev.
She, sorry, I can't see it right. Okay, yeah. Helen?
Yes, hello again. One of the questions that was put was whether or not national policies are restricting the development of affordable housing. This is something that the council could have addressed years ago, because the NPPF paragraph 64 allows local authorities to in designated rural areas require affordable housing contributions from developments of 5 houses or fewer, and or perhaps almost all of the settlements identified under policy RA2 are designated rural areas under the Housing Act 1985. So is this something that will be introduced in the revised core strategy? I'd also really be interested to know about why the council has never used that option, given given the problem, the severe problem that we've got in this county with the delivery of affordable housing. You're muted, Kevin.
Sorry. It's our understanding that it's not covered by the relevant element of the Housing Act in terms of rural designation. That was the case when we came at the core strategy examination in public, where the ministerial statement had just emerged on the new threshold, and prior to that, in terms of the run-up to that, there was an assumption we would be taking, or we would use all contributions from all housing in rural areas, including an element even for the 1s and 2s at the time. So that is something probably out with the local plan that the council could consider, because I know Shropshire was in a similar position and is looking at changing that rural designation within Herefordshire via changes at parliamentary level. So it's something that they're examining, and it's something that I think our members are quite keen to explore. So that in that case, we would look to probably have some sort of flexible policy that enabled that to happen, should that change be made at national level. So yes, we recognise, I think, the severe restrictions on achieving affordable housing in rural areas that threshold is having, and if possible, I think there's a willingness to change that.
Scott.
Thank you. Yeah. In terms of the question about the sort of site allocation, settlement boundaries, I think it would be, in developing the neighbourhood, the local plans, it would certainly be helpful, I think, to ensure lack of ambiguity. There is an issue with our current neighbourhood development plan, because we're sort of essentially 3-4 sort of villages, if you like, sort of dispersed. So there are a couple of areas that are identified in the core strategy for where small scale infill development might be permitted, but the specific boundaries of those within the group parish aren't defined, and that has led to some considerable debate about what the plan intended as opposed to what it says. So whether it's a case of devolving those back up to the local authority or not, I think the point for me is to make sure that in all of those plans, when they're signed off at the final stage, that those things are very, very clear. Otherwise, it causes significant problems in trying to determine what should be allowed.
Thank you. Sylvia?
Yeah, just firstly, I think it's imperative that the current role of the neighbourhood development plan is with the is retained. That point about localism, that there has been some kind of local democracy and local input in terms of determining settlement boundaries and potential sites for housing. It is absolutely essential, and I think local people across the county who've been involved in the process would be dismayed to see that element was being taken away from them and given back to the local planning authority, Herefordshire itself. So I just think that would be a really retrograde step. Secondly, just a quick point, the housing needs survey that accompanies this consultation, there are some errors in that. I realise it was conducted by a London company, but it has some serious errors, and I'm just wondering if actually the housing needs identified are correct. You know, just one example is it goes on about the train station in Ross-on-Wye as one example. Also, just quickly, I'd like to endorse the points being made by Helen just now. I think there is a problem where developers put in for 2 sites of 7 or 8 houses, often on adjoining sites as well, and yet they are looked at by the LPA as separate applications, when clearly one of the things they're doing is trying to avoid the requirement to build affordable housing, because they're saying it's 2 different sites and not one large site, which would mean that they had to build some affordable housing. And last but not least, I think there is a bit of an issue where the debate is around what should happen about isolated rural homes, by which I assume it means a house on its own in the middle of the countryside, as opposed to more sustainable locations. And I think there is a real issue about understanding that many of our smaller villages are not sustainable locations because they have absolutely no facilities or services at all. Or if they do have something, they just got a village hall or perhaps a church. And so therefore you're entirely dependent on the private car and on delivery vans in a lot of rural villages, and yet some of them on the current housing hierarchy are deemed to be sustainable locations. They're clearly not. So I was pleased to see that there has been a lot of support for building in more sustainable locations where people actually do have a wider range of facilities. Thank you.
Mr. Avery. You're still on mute, Paul.
Hello, is that better?
Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you now, Paul.
Right, I just wanted to underline what Sylvia said. The importance of neighbourhood development plans should not be underestimated. A lot of people put a lot of time, all the voters, all the populations within the parishes had lots of endless consultations to decide what they wanted. They've decided what they wanted, and it's very important that that's not taken back to the centre. It was a good democratic process. It was a tough one and very professionally handled. And I think that should really be respected.
Thank you. Rosine? You're still on mute as well.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Sorry about that. I'd like to support the last comment. The neighbourhood development plan, when we, in our area at Much Birch, it took, we're not slow learners, but it did take us 5 years of proper consultation. When we started, people were saying, oh, they never listen to us, you know, they'll just change it as soon as we've got it in. Well, ours has been agreed and operating for a year. We took enormous trouble to consult. People came in, they looked at things. I'm sure a lot of you have had the same experience. And people did feel and accept confidently the plan that was agreed. Now, if Hereford Council come back and say, well, we're going to take this bit of it and that bit of it and leave us with pretty, you know, pictures of what might have been, I think people will totally give up on participation in the planning process. We already see the ways in which developers bring people in who don't bother to even look at our plan. We are then able to say, well, this is in the plan, and this gives, when it goes to planning consultation, it is there and it is a reason why they should reconsider. So I really think if Hereford Council are wanting to save money, what they might think about is find the key points, send them back to the neighbourhood plans and say, what would this mean for your neighbourhood plan? Could it be done without having huge consultations and employing more consultants to do it in relation to neighbourhood plans? We can do it if Hereford are clear what they want to do. We can build on what has already been achieved. But I think to take it away, you will just reinforce 5 years ago how disappointed people felt about being included in planning.
Thank you, Rosie. Kevin?
Sam? Yeah, I mean, I was going to just really agree with everything that's been said so far regarding the settlement boundary and site selection. It seems that those are the key aspects of the neighbourhood plan, and you take those away from us and, you know, we will just basically forget about the neighbourhood plan. If Hereford Council want to get rid of neighbourhood plans, I think that would be the way of doing it. Based on, I'm Found Up Parish Council, by the way, based on our experience, I think what we really need to see is more support from Herefordshire Council's planning department in implementing the policies in the neighbourhood plan. We've really been quite disappointed by the lack of support that we've had from the county planning department. You know, we very often see applications coming in, as the previous lady said, that make no mention, no reference to the neighbourhood plan. And it seems to be up to the parish council to go back to those applicants and ask them to put in, to go through the plan, refer to it, put a design and access statement that explains how they're going to, you know, comply with the policies, or if they can't, why not? And that just doesn't seem to come from the county planning department. So I don't really understand why that is. Anyway, thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Lisa?
Hi there, good morning. I'd like to draw attention to the question that Michael Handley has raised in the chat. That's something that, that I've questioned quite a few times, whether or not these conditions are actually looked at and adhered to. There was another question that I had. Whilst I understand the need for affordable houses, if you have developments in small rural villages, how do you actually stop investors buying these houses to rent out? Because that happened with one development that I'm aware of. So that's one problem. So is it possible then that you, I don't know, place restrictions on who can actually buy these properties for a certain length of time before it's actually open to the wider market? Because I do understand that these properties need selling eventually. However, if you're building affordable houses that are then being snapped up, they no longer become available to the younger people in the community. sustainable locations, what Sylvia said, completely and utterly agree with her. I mean, it's all well and good having these ideas of, oh, you can't build a house that's on its own and you have to build it in sustainable locations. Well, we have no mains gas. Most people around here we don't even have main sewerage in the village. So how are they then seen to be sustainable? Because then, of course, you have more, I don't know, waste treatment plants or cesspits or whatever you want to call it, put in place, which then puts a strain on our biodiversity. So you have runoff going into the villages and into the streams and into the brooks. And then the open areas plus developments don't really sort of go hand in hand, do they? Because how can you have open areas but then expect more developments to be built? Again, you know, if you can't have a single dwelling, which, you know, the rural location lends itself to, especially with these, the ability to turn redundant, should we put that in inverted commas, farm buildings into, that they can be turned into houses. Very, very often they are in the middle of a field or on their own. So, I mean, a lot of these plans or a lot of these restrictions and ideas seem to be coming from central government that have absolutely no idea how things actually are in rural communities. I mean, we're quite lucky in the village that we have quite a, you know, we've got several things, but we don't have any shops. We don't, like I said, we don't have any, we have no main sewage, we have no mains gas. All of our gas or oil for heating is shipped in. So what's going to happen when you have even more houses built in small locations? I mean, I don't know. It just seems to be, you've got one idea, you have to have the open plans. Then you can't have the open plans because you need to put houses on these open areas. It just, I don't know. It all seems, it's not very joined up thinking for rural areas, is it?
Just to make you aware, I think your clerks would have received a parish audit this morning, which is the first part of the review of the rural settlement hierarchy work that we're doing. And that's to check the base data about what services, facilities, what the road conditions, environmental constraints are. And we will be looking at that new settlement hierarchy and consulting you on that in the summer as well. John?
Just wanted to echo the comments that have been made about the erosion of the existing neighbourhood plans. Those have been voted for as a result of a democratic process. And under the localism legislation, it seems to me that that would make it automatically subject to judicial review if there were any attempt to erode the existence of the existing plans.
All existing plans will remain part of the development plan until the new local plan is adopted. So
by taking away the new local plan, by imposing a new local plan, if that were to erode the policies that have been democratically elected for, would that not automatically make them subject to judicial review?
No, because you're still part of the development plan. Those plans still have material weight until the next plan comes along, and that's part of natural plan making. So that wouldn't be subject to a judicial review.
Okay, thank you.
Angie?
Yeah, hi. As a town clerk, what you've just said we have received in our inboxes this morning, we haven't. Or if anybody else has, I haven't.
Yeah, it's only for rural parishes, not the towns.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Yeah. Jeff Hughes? You're on mute, Jeff.
Is that better? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, Sam, this is probably something for you. Going back to a point that was made earlier, in terms of the practicality and the timing of this, what would happen in a situation where the local plan is adopted, a developer comes forward with something which shows that there is a very clear discrepancy between what the local plan says and what an original neighbourhood development plan says. Does it then revert to the local plan? Does the neighbourhood plan become redundant? What would a parish council do in that kind of position?
It's the last adopted document that takes precedent if there's a difference in the policies. So until the new local plan we're talking about now is adopted, your neighbourhood plans are the last adopted document. As soon as the local plan becomes adopted, then it obviously is the last adopted document.
So it would then be down to a parish council to decide at that point whether they were going to review the neighbourhood plan to come back in line with the new local plan?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
And if we continue with neighbourhood plans, then you can twin track that anyway. Once the new settlement hierarchy is released and you'll know which villages are looking at proportional growth or not, you could start that process of looking at the review of your neighbourhood plan in line with the local plan, so they adopt in a twin tracking sort of process.
Okay, because I'm just thinking about how we make sure that developers don't take advantage of the situation where they pick up what is a clear discrepancy and use that to try and secure planning permission. That's my concern.
Yeah. I think that's all the hands now, Kev. Oh, no, Ian.
Hi. I hope I'm not on mute. Sorry. I represent Herefordshire District Parish Councils. We have a concern about a lot of all the local plan developments. Is there are two bits missing, or seem to be totally missing, and that's a policy on the hierarchy of the various policies. And this discussion on development seems to highlight those issues. And also actually a compliance policy, because I mean, that's a fundamental thing in almost every corporate industry. Compliance is an overriding policy, and there's nothing here, and there continues to be nothing here. And that's where we have concerns about the management control of all these processes. Because if we do then have a new local plan adopted, the same mistakes are going to happen because there's no methodology to make sure that people do the right thing and the decisions taken in the planning department are consistent. And that's something we've noticed within the planning permissions granted in our area. It seems to depend on whichever planning officer looks at things and how they interpret the various policies.
Thank you for that. I mean, it's always been that the starting point is obviously the development plan in terms of determining planning applications, and that includes neighbourhood plan policies as part of that. So that should be the way decisions are made. That's the starting point. It's only then whether there's material considerations which are strong enough to outweigh those policies, or the policies are so out of date that they're no longer relevant, that the policy position should be overridden effectively.
Yeah. But it's more, so if you have a policy on local sort of green spaces, and that conflicts with development policy, which one takes priority? And there's nothing written down, so it's a complete shambles at the moment because it depends on who addresses it.
Okay, all right. We can certainly look at that, and I suppose the key there is to minimise the amount of conflict between policies. Occasionally there will be that, and it is a factor that needs to be considered. But I think we need to aim to minimise conflict between policies at all times, so that situation doesn't arise. Really. So yeah. Any other? Sylvia, is it? And then maybe we'll move to the last section.
Yeah, can I just ask a straightforward question? There clearly seems to be no appetite among the people attending this meeting to scrap neighbourhood development plans or to hand over the allocation of sites and village settlement boundaries to the LPA. So could you just be honest with us and say, is there actually some kind of plan or intention to actually do that, to scrap neighbourhood development plans? Is that on the cards? Because we just need to know.
No, it's just a genuine question. As Siobhan pointed out, we've been doing that for 10 years now. We've got to the point where we're reviewing the local plan. The last core strategy was written with neighbourhood plans in mind, and actually delegated the site allocations and the settlement boundaries down to local communities. It's just the point in time when we now review the local plan, it's the right time to now ask, do you want us to do that again? Do you want us to delegate those issues back down to the neighbourhood plan, or do you want it taken back? Because we do have some people that say they don't want to do that again. We've obviously got some parishes that haven't taken on neighbourhood planning, so we get the feeling that they didn't want to go through that process. So it's just a genuine question. So if you want to see neighbourhood plans continue, then please respond accordingly to the consultation, so that we get that feeling from parish councils. But there's no hidden agenda. It's just a genuine question.
Thanks, I'm sure you can appreciate my sudden paranoia about that after everything we've been through.
I get that, Sylvia, don't worry.
Right. Okay, thanks ever so much.
And to be honest, I think if it was down to officers, we would continue with the same. You know, we think it's been successful as officers, so we would want to continue with it.
Just to make you aware, Mr. Crippins has his hand up.
Yeah. Mr. Crippin. You're still on mute.
There we are. I'm not very good at this. Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay. With regard to the housing situation, it's clear that houses are not being built for local people and to meet local need. Developers are obviously interested in making money, and why shouldn't they be? But in the process, the provision of housing to meet local needs is being sidelined. Policies have for years referenced the need for affordable housing, and yet all we're seeing is development of executive houses, which is almost certainly drawing in people from elsewhere who can sell their properties, perhaps in London or the southeast, a modest house, and they can come to Herefordshire and buy a small executive palace. This is not helping the local population with their housing situation. One of the success stories has been shared housing. One of your speakers interestingly referenced the problem of outsiders buying up small houses in rural areas for second homes. Now, if there was a promotion of shared housing, the housing associations, who would presumably be the developers in this case, could decide who has these houses and how they're occupied. And that would give young couples, young families, the opportunity to get a foot on the housing ladder. I think that serious consideration should be given in the county to a major promotion of shared housing schemes. I know that requires capital input through housing associations. I'm not quite sure where that will come from. But I think that one of the ways of stopping this degradation of the housing stock for young families is to promote such schemes. We really need to seriously consider the problem of this, because if we're not careful, there will be nowhere for our young families to live other than stay with mum and dad. And I think most of the people I've seen on the screen today have been mums and dads. And much as one loves one's children, it's good to see the back of them sometimes. The other point which has been raised is the value of NDPs. And I think that this was a process by which the mother knows best perception of planning policy and enforcement was dismissed, and local communities began to feel that they had a say in what was going on. I think that NDPs are a very valuable conduit between the population and the decision makers at the county. Thank you.
Thank you. One last one from Roger before we move on.
Yes, thank you. Might I just quickly say that speaking for Kinnersley and District Group Parish Council, one of the 13% that don't have an NDP, it would probably be wrong to take that as being a disinterest or not supporting NDPs in principle. We don't have an NDP, and we didn't have an NDP because, quite frankly, we didn't have a local champion, but also, and I think more realistically, we are extraordinarily rurally diversified, and just felt that the existing constraints on planning would protect us from the worst things that we feared might happen. And that has actually proved to be the case. We have had more houses built in our group parish area than the core strategy. I'm not going to say allowed for, because you were allowed to go beyond the recommended figures, but it's done absolutely no harm at all. We've had some perfectly good housing built. People are buying them and coming to live in them. And all I would say about rural policy is that I do think we have to be mindful, and I think Sylvia touched on this, but I don't think we see it in quite the same way. And that is that a lot of these small, very small rural hamlets, villages, have very little in the way of what is put into the sustainability column. We no longer have a pub. We do have a village hall. We have churches in each of our parishes. But quite frankly, if we don't allow for house building and development in the most rural parts of the county, then I think over time, those parts of the county will just go to waste. And I think it's not beyond the wit of man or woman to come up with policies that acknowledge the fact that we are moving to a world where we will all be driving electric cars. There are ways of building houses that have little or no effect really on buying small numbers of houses in rural, truly rural areas, and do good, because people then buy into the community. We don't have an NDP, but we did embrace localism. I think if there are signs that that level of interest and local control is eroded or taken away, then I think people will withdraw from that, and so these communities will just gently degrade. Yes, that's all I would say.
Thank you, Roger. I think we can probably move to the. There's another hand up. Sorry, we'll take one. Is it John Hulse? We'll take this as the last hand before we move on.
Thank you. It's only a quick question, just to understand in this consultation process, because quite clearly a lot of the comments that we've had have been in support of the retention of the neighbourhood plans. How are the responses weighted? Because clearly we are a group of parish councils on this call this morning, but we've got a wider range of consultation. How will those responses be weighted? Will it be one individual saying that they think that neighbourhood plans should be eroded, as opposed to a parish council saying they should be retained?
There's no magic around that, but we will take out the sort of organisation. We'll look at the organisational responses and see where they are. And clearly, parish councils are probably the key organisation in terms of this particular question and this particular area. So they will be a critical element when we go back to it. And that's probably the first thing our members will ask: what did the parish council say on this particular point? So there's not a, as I say, a scientific way of weighting the responses, but we will look at what the parish councils have said. And clearly, if the overwhelming majority, as it appears this morning, are keen on maintaining that sort of total flexibility for what the parish, the neighbourhood plans say, then we will report that and give that significant weight, but accordingly. If I was estimating, I think probably this question will be of interest more to parish councils than others anyway. Sorry, Anna Coda's got a question. Do you want to ask the question before we move on to the next section?
Well, we've heard a lot about the type of housing that's being built in rural areas, and we've heard a bit about how difficult it is for local people to afford houses anywhere in Herefordshire. One gentleman mentioned shared ownership, but obviously, even in my village, Peace Church, and certainly some of the villages around me, at one time there'd been lots of people renting. They're still renting in many cases, but they're no longer renting houses at affordable rent with security of tenure, i.e. council housing. And because those houses have been bought and they're still renting them, but from private landlords. So I know it is really difficult in the current climate, but it is something that we do need to look at. What used to be called old-fashioned council housing, or whether it's directly from the council or from housing associations, because with the best will in the world, there are loads of people throughout Herefordshire, even and in rural communities, not just the city, who will not realistically be able to afford to buy, but will have to rent. And at the moment, they're at the mercies of private landlords, whether corporate or individual. And we haven't touched upon this at all, but I do know it's a really difficult area for local authorities because nationally it's been something that's not been wanted recently.
Yeah. I mean, all I can say on that is the council is interested in building its own housing stock. So that's a slightly separate process from what we're talking about today, which is the sort of, it wouldn't be a policy of the plan itself, but the council is interested in building council houses and is investigating its own sort of portfolio of land holdings and how it can bring that forward. Again, I think we probably can move on now to the final topic areas, which I think is going to be covered by Stuart. Stuart, are you able to carry on? Seem to have lost our final presenter.
Stuart, I think you're on mute.
Apologies for this, just don't know who. Dan, are you still on the call? Would you be able to cover these topic areas? Have you still got the notes for these areas?
Hi, Kev, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Sorry, for some reason Zoom threw me out. Okay, can you give me a second just to?
Yes, certainly. Yeah, yeah.
Give me a sec. Okay, sorry about that, everyone. Sometimes you get technical problems. So I'll just whiz through these options then. So obviously the first slide you can see here is covering employment as a theme. This will include policies concerning issues concerning the provision of employment land, the safeguarding of employment land, and also enabling home working. As perhaps some of you would know, Herefordshire does actually have has the lowest economic output of any county in England, which is about 19% below the national average. But on the benefit side, it does benefit from relatively low unemployment levels. Herefordshire also does, however, have a low wage economy. It also has a deficit of high level skills, along with an ageing population and a shortage of labour. In the core strategy plan period so far, there's been under-delivery of new unemployment sites, with only one of the strategic employment allocations having come forward so far. And a key piece of evidence that will form the content of the local plan is with Herefordshires Employment Land Requirement Study, which is currently being carried out by a company, BE Limited. So this study is now underway and is going to provide crucial up-to-date evidence on the employment land needs across the county, the availability of potential employment sites, and it also conclude with a set recommendations for appropriate policy approaches. An important shift in national planning policy recently that will affect the approach to the new plan in this area are the changes that have been made to the use class order, which came into effect in September 2020. Which are use classes formerly classified as B1 and now have been moved into a much broader classification called Class E. So these alterations, which allow for permitted development rights, may mean that a change of policy approach may be necessary if the local plan is to continue to be able to safeguard the county's highest quality employment sites being lost to other uses. Creative and green technology sectors have a key role to play in the transition to a low carbon economy, such as solar roof tiles, other things such as smart flower solar panels, living buildings, vertical and indoor farming, biodegradable burial pods, so all sorts of issues like this, edible plastic alternatives, and energy harvesting floorboards, just to name but a few. So a huge opportunity of different green technology sectors there. Perhaps some suggestions in regards to employment policy. Should policies primarily aim to decarbonise the local economy and seek to promote creative and green technologies? Should the local plan seek to protect existing land values and employment use? And should the employment section of the local plan have a separate policy enabling home working and home-based businesses? So the next section we'll be briefly looking into is town centres and issues relating to retail and how the local plan may address these. So it's probably apparent to most of us that the way people use town centres has undergone significant changes in recent years. The COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated the already existing trends from physically visiting shops to moving to shopping more and more online. So this will lead us to consider how town centres may take on new functions, becoming more places for social and leisure activities, rather than just purely for shopping. As mentioned previously, September 2020, the use class order was significantly amended, with new classes E and F being introduced. These cover commercial, business and service uses and supersede the previous classes of A, B1 and D. And we've also seen the introduction of a class MA, which permits change of use from class E to residential class C3, with some exceptions such as pubs and listed buildings. So the intention of these recent changes is to bring back greater flexibility in the town centres in response to our changing shopping habits. As part of the local plan update, the council has commissioned the town centre retail assessment for the plan period up to 2041. And this is going to ensure the evidence base we use from our emerging policies will be both accurate and up to date. The assessment is expected to be completed by early summer this year. So in regards to town and retail suggestions to consider perhaps are these use of existing primary shopping area designation could be reviewed. The traditional role of retail being the main function of town centres now appears to be in transition. So do we need to ask, does this degradation reflect modern town centres' changing role? And also should be looking to allowing more diversification of uses permitted in town centres to make the more resilient and flexible for the future. And additionally, with the recent changes in permitted development of Class E and the new Class MA, there may be opportunity to draft an additional policy about the use of upper floors within town centre buildings for residential and office use. There's been some concerns nationally of housing permitted in this way. So moving on to the final theme, that's in regards to tourism. So tourism does play an important role in the economy of Herefordshire, accounting for over 5,000 jobs in the county. A challenge for the planning system is how development proposals can be best supported in the new local plan without adverse impacts on Herefordshire's natural and historic assets. That's in themselves central to the county's visitors' appeal. So there's an increasing demand for proposals for the less traditional form of visitor accommodation, such as glamping sites and woodland cabin parks in the rural parts of the county. Many will propose tourist developments in the rural areas, as these are locations which attract most visitors. So in terms of sustainable development, there are attentions in this principle, which usually directs proposals to the larger settlements of the county, with the numerous applications for new developments in the open countryside. So perhaps should the local plan also provide a definition of exactly what is sustainable tourism, so that applicants and the public understand what may be acceptable in policy terms. So some points to consider in relation to tourism policy, could be, should the local plan seek to define sustainable locations in which rural visitor accommodation can be permitted? And should the local plan, or perhaps a supplementary planning document, provide guidance, specific guidance on tourist accommodation such as glamping sites and forest cabins? So that brings us to the end of our presentation, and so we can have an opportunity for further discussion on the three themes we've briefly covered on, which are employment, town centres and tourism. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks for that. Heloise, you've got a hand up.
Hello. Yeah, thank you. I'm wondering how you measure wage rates within the county. Are you able to capture the rates of wages or salaries of the many people who work from home for an employer outside the county? Because that's going to have particularly as we work more and more from home, that will have a significant impact on the employment opportunities for many people, certainly at the higher levels of skills and earning capacity. Does that make sense to you? So if you gather wage data just from employees within the county, you're not going to capture the value of the work done by people who are living in the county and working for employers outside the county.
Yeah, I do understand that, and that may be a difficulty. I mean, the data sets are probably national and regional data sets that we use, and we don't do any surveys ourselves. But you're right that as that pattern changes, we will need to understand what implications that those changes have in terms of remote working and so on.
Yeah,
yes,
I mean, personally, I've lived here in the county for 15 years. And I've never worked for an employer within the county. I've worked for national government outside in Bristol and in London. And there are so many people like that, and increasingly so.
It's a good point, and we'll need to investigate how we do that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Helen?
Yes, I've got a couple of queries, stroke observations. I mean, one of them is about promoting home work and home businesses. It seems to me that this is a very tricky area because it's already really covered, by national policy in that, as long as it remains the subsidiary use of the building, then it's acceptable. I think once you start promoting home businesses, you're into the territory of actually really intruding on the amenity of neighbours, and so which again would be the planning judgment that you would make in any circumstances of enforcement, is what the impact of that development is on having the neighbours. I think there would be a danger in having a policy which presumed that you could set up, for example, a workshop in your garden that might have an adverse impact on neighbours. So that's just a concern. My other is about this concept of sustainable locations for rural tourism developments. And I have seen on a number of occasions applications for glamping sites and so on refused on the grounds of them being in an unsustainable location, which rather sort of misses the point of people wanting to come on holiday to Herefordshire and enjoy being in a remote location in the countryside. And that's why people want to come here. They don't want to be in a town or on the main highway network. And I think that you have to put it alongside the rights that people have, for example, under the Caravan Sites Act, where they can, without planning permission, create, camping sites or caravan sites without the need for planning permission. And so, I think those two things need to be balanced and, recognise what actually what actually attracts people to come and visit the county. So I think that probably there is clearly a need for a definition, but it needs to it needs to sort of recognise what people are visiting the county for.
Thank you. Yeah, good points. Tony Usher.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me? Oops.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, good. I'm Tony Usher from Dawson Parish Council. I'd like to just address a few points regarding rural employment. Currently, our village and parish is about a 50-50 split of housing. And most people are involved in either the rural economy directly, i.e. via farming or contracting, or commuting out to local towns or possibly Hereford itself. However, there's quite a substantial part of that population that actually works off a home business, and these are often beyond the village parameters itself. This may include people who do part-time IT work, consulting work, and also providing B&B or holiday lets. And my question is, or my point is rural broadband. Now, the village and those properties along the main B4348, which runs through the Golden Valley, have luckily had superfast broadband for about 4 or 5 years now. It was a very hot topic in the early, about 10 years ago. However, it all seems to have died off, and we now have a good half of our parish who are still working off sub 2 megabyte connections, often sub 1. And those are the people who will have maybe redundant farm buildings that they would like to turn into accommodation, or a joint purpose building where they can run a small business from. These people are finding it extremely difficult in order to, one, attract people to come to their bed and breakfast or their self-catering, because when they find out, well, there's no real internet connection, then the customers will go elsewhere. And also that individual who wants to live in the parish, has an IT qualification, wants to work remotely, but finds that he can't unless he's down in the village centre, which is not practical for him. So I would like to just try and put that point back on the agenda, that there are still an awful lot of people who are not being served by super fast broadband, or in fact any form of broadband, out in the more remote rural parishes. And it's something that needs to be addressed urgently, not just in the long distance future. Okay, that's it.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and as you say, digital infrastructure becomes as important as physical infrastructure in many respects. So yeah, thank you for that point. Kevin Braybrook.
Thank you. Yeah, my point is regarding tourism. We have a little bit of a conundrum here in that we're seeing, quite a few people turning their houses into Airbnb properties. We've had a couple of applications for extensions or new developments that we've granted on the basis that we thought they were going to be contributing to local housing stock, and then it turns out that they're put onto the Airbnb website and are essentially being run as businesses. So not only are they not contributing to the local housing stock, that they're not actually really being run as a formal business, because I don't think that Airbnbs have to have all of the sort of fire protection insurance, etc., that somebody running a holiday business would have to. So we sort of looked at it. Do we need to put some sort of policy in place to try and limit the use of homes on Airbnb? And then it was pointed out to us that, well, in our neighbourhood plan, not only do we say that we want to encourage affordable housing for local people, but we also want to encourage local businesses and encourage tourism into the area. So we sort of found ourselves in a little bit of a sort of forked stick there. So I think if the county could come up with some sort of policy particularly on this Airbnb issue, I think that would be very helpful guidance for a lot of us.
Thank you for that. I think that's an area we can look at. Scott Crowley.
Thank you. Yeah, just sort of picking up, I think, on Tony Usher's point, I just wanted to sort of second that. I'm one of the directors of Herefordshire Community Networks, which is a community interest company, and we developed fast broadband in Dewsall, Callow, and some of the surrounding areas about 6 years ago in response to the woefully slow rollout of national broadband. And we've seen the joint venture by Hereford and Gloucester, Fastershire, who've taken an approach of trying to get large companies in to do the rollout, like GigaClear, and in the case of GigaClear, they've been pushed off the contract because they couldn't deliver it. Now that has opened up opportunities for people to get the vouchers to do it themselves. But I do think, and I appreciate this is outside the planning remit, I do think there's a need for a bit of joined up thinking in the council to ensure that flexible ways of delivering broadband are available so that we can encourage people to work from home, and where appropriate, encourage tourism, given that Wi-Fi is quite important for a lot of people. So yeah, I think my point is about the council looking at all options to deliver broadband, because there has been I suppose a bias in favour of getting large companies to do it, as opposed to necessarily supporting local communities to do it via mechanisms such as HCN did.
Thank you for that. I'm conscious of the time. We're approaching 12 o'clock. Has anyone got, and we maybe take one more before I...
Mr. Crippin's waving, Kevin.
Is it Mr. Crippin? Okay, yeah. Mr. Crippin? I think you're still muted.
Thank you for that. This is a learning curve, by the way. One topic that has been touched on is infrastructure. Certainly out here in the Wild West, we're acutely aware of the fact that our roads are falling to pieces. The demands on the local GP services are exceeding what they can supply. It is almost impossible now to get yourself signed up to a dentist. And these are just examples of the kind of deteriorating infrastructure that we are experiencing. And we are inviting, through the NDP programs, we're building more houses, we're inviting more people to come and live in these areas, but the infrastructure is not there to support increased populations. And certainly, I think that as part of county-wide consideration of further development, we really need, or the council needs to seriously address the whole problem of infrastructure in the rural areas. Because, if people are going to come and live here, they expect to have services. People that are already here are demanding better services, and they're just not available. And I think that we are witnessing a slowly developing crisis in lack of infrastructure in the rural areas. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, I suppose there's that survey that's gone out, or hopefully gone out today, which would be useful to get as many responses from the parishes as possible on that. And I think we're asking for, it's a factual check, so we're asking for things to come back to us by the 25th of April, if at all possible, on that. Sam mentioned it earlier. It is 12 o'clock, so I will draw the session to an end. But again, I'd really like to thank you all for participating. We've got some comments in the chat, I think, which we haven't gone through yet as well. So we'll try and summarize them and post any responses to them on the website as well as publishing the presentations and the question and answer sessions. The consultation is going to continue until mid-May, and we encourage as many responses as possible through that process. As I said, that in addition, there's the audit gone out today, or the audit survey gone out today. And then we are looking at a third sort of options type consultation, which we're hoping to run through June and July. And that will be more on the place-based proposals or options as they're emerging for Hereford, for each of the market towns, and the sort of rural settlement hierarchy as well. So some options around that, which hopefully will address some of the issues that you've raised with us this morning. Again, I'd like to thank everyone for taking part. It's been really useful, and hope to see you at the next event. Thank you.